Morning, everybody. It's Rabbi Kolakowski, Koblenzer Rebbe here, answering your questions, talking about various things, whether it be in religion, politics, or just things that I came to my attention that I want to address. So, one of our viewers today, last week, asked a question. It was on our video about apologetics and about how much stock we should put into apologetics and how we should view apologetics. And I think this question underlies one of the major problems with apologetics is that we try to, when people put too much stock into apologetics, they are bound to lose their faith because they're like, oh, my rabbi said this, so that must be true, and it makes sense to me. But then you do some research and like, well, maybe yes, maybe no. But the truth of the matter is things like this really don't matter much. Now, I wouldn't say even that the national revelation argument is a make it or break it argument. It's the Rambam presents it as this is the reason why we take this as logical. It's not actually a proof. That's one thing that all of the Jewish apologetists make clear is that this is not a proof. This is a logical conclusion that one could reach. If you read something like Leib Kellerman, Lawrence Kellerman, Permission to Believe, Permission to Receive, he brings all of the classical apologetic arguments in a clear manner. As to why we believe that Orthodox Judaism is the true faith. But again, it's permission. It's presented as permission to believe and permission to receive, not absolute proof. And I'm worried if I say the words absolute proof that this video could get dinged for another reason. So let's keep it civil here, right? So anyway, but that's the truth of the matter. The Rambam says this is the reason why we believe, and he does say that it's a mitzvah to know. But again, the other thing that we have to understand is that language is a difficult thing to, when there's a French saying that a translator is a traitor, and I'm sure that doesn't sound quite the same in French as it does in English. But the truth of the matter is, you cannot actually understand any text in a translation. And there are many translations, some are better, some are worse. But the truth of the matter is, even if you compare all of them, and you study all of them, if you don't have at least a basic grasp of the original language of whatever text that you're studying, you're still never going to fully understand it. So that's true. Everyone recognizes with a text like the Tao Te Ching, of which there are so many different translations. It's a very brief text, and yet there's a tremendous amount of depth to this text. But a lot of people just assume that, their King James Bible, that's the be-all and end-all. That's the Bible. I read the Bible every day, and I don't mean to be mocking, but I do mean to point out something, is that if you're not reading the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew and Aramaic, with the original tongues, and the truth of the matter is also when you see the Hebrew translations of Aramaic texts, or even Hebrew translations of Greek texts, and most likely a lot of those Greek texts might have been written in another language as well. So we're dealing with translations upon translations and so forth. it's not as simple as everybody just bears it out to be. It's like, this is it. And it's true whether you're reading Art Scroll or Feldheim or Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan or any of the Jewish translations or the JPS or whatever it is. And whether it's the old JPS or the new JPS. The new JPS certainly it's more of a paraphrase than a translation. But then the other point is that in the Jewish tradition, we always had more paraphrases than classical translations, because you can't really translate this text. You have to examine it and meditate upon it and so forth. And it's different than other texts. And the same is true, with all due respect, with other religions as well. There's a reason why Muslims do not even consider a translation of the Quran to truly be a Quran. That it's only a Quran in Arabic that is a Quran, and they'll point and note the same thing that we say about our texts. When you talk to an imam about studying the Quran and so forth, he said it's a very difficult text. It's not. It shouldn't be taken at face value. And the same is true of any other sacred text of all the various faiths. But with that being said, a lot of people seek to have some kind of agenda that they want to push, and they'll find some text and make a whole theology out of it. And I think I've mentioned before on this channel an interesting story that I read in a book of how it was the story of how I got to read this story was that when I was the Rav in Richmond, PBS filmed a TV show at the Jefferson Hotel on the issue of the Bible in public policy, and Chuck Colburn was there, the famous prison ministry head. I got to talk to him for a few minutes. He wasn't very friendly, but I'm sure he was tired. It was late. Didn't seem so happy to see me, to be honest, but it's something I can talk about to when I'm talking to Christians at work, with my work in prison ministry, that I got to meet Chuck Colburn. I have his autograph somewhere. Book they gave out, all the speakers there gave out books, and they signed them. And one of the speakers there, who was my least favorite speaker, was an atheist of Jewish heritage, Jewish ancestry, and a very arrogant college professor, a Bible scholar, self-proclaimed Bible scholar is the way I see it, because, or if not self-proclaimed, because he does have his PhD and so forth, but presenting it in a very different way than we understand biblical scholarship to be in our circles, in traditional Jewish circles. But our sages do teach that the one who is wise, the one who learns from all men, from all people, from all human beings. And so even a heretic like this is something can learn from. And I think this was one of the most valuable things that I've read from a secular perspective, and brings out a very important point, was that he tells a story about how a group of their fellow secular Bible scholars went out drinking one night at a bar in Washington, D.C., where their college is, and their senior professor was among them. they had a long discussion about what does the Bible, uh, what opinions the Bible have on various hot button issues, abortion or homosexuality, or a lot of these type of policy issues, but also perhaps other issues as far as theology and so forth. And the elder scholar among them was just sitting and listening to them, drinking and drinking, until finally he spoke up, and he had imbibed quite a bit by that time, and in somewhat of a drunken stupor. We have a saying, in the Talmud, our sages teach that nichnas yain yetze sod, that when wine comes in, the secrets come out. And I think this was what, his inhibitions were holding him back from saying something very profound. He said that the Bible itself has no opinions. The Bible is pure energy. And it's we as human beings that use that energy to fit our agendas. Although, of course, we, in the hubris of our faith tradition, we Orthodox Jews teach that not only do we have an oral tradition, which other traditions do. Of course, the Catholics have their oral traditions, and the Eastern Orthodox have their oral traditions. And the truth of the matter is every translation is essentially an oral tradition, and even just being able to read, as our sages point out, is an oral tradition, because someone approached, I believe, Rabbi Akiva, and said, I want you to teach me only the written Torah, only the Bible, without an oral tradition. So he said, well, first you have to learn how to read. So he said, this is Aleph, this is Beis, this is A, and this is B. All right, come back tomorrow. So the next day he came back and he pointed to A and said, this is B, and he pointed to B and said, this is A. And he said, wait a minute. Yes, they told me you said this is A and this is B, and now you're telling me this is B and this is A. And he said, well, that's why you need an oral tradition, because you don't know what anything is. You don't even know how to read unless somebody taught you how to read. And of course, there's much more to it than that, but the tradition that we have is that, at least in potential energy, or in some form, that the bald eagle is beautiful, is that the oral traditions that we have are rooted from Sinai. It's not just the Bible, but it's also an oral tradition that comes from what God gave to Moses. And that's how we understand the Bible. And the truth of the matter is, there is no other way, because there are words in the Bible. First of all, the Hebrew Bible has no vowels. The vowels are an oral tradition. And so if you could imagine a Bible where all the vowels were missing, and you try to interpret that, so you'd get a fair idea of most of the words, but especially if you knew the context and you knew there's no other words with these consonants, and you have a basic idea. There are hints of which vowels belong in certain places, and there are rules about it, so it's not really that difficult. But here and there, so 90% of the vowels you can pretty much figure out if you know the language. You're not just reading a language you don't understand, but you understand what you're reading. But every now and then there are, especially from context, but every now and then there's words that there's no way to know from context. And the classic is chalav and chalev. Chalav means milk, and chalev means a certain type of fat. And so the scripture says not to cook a kid in its mother's milk. But how do you know it's not its mother's fat? And also the scripture says that certain fats are prohibited, but how do you know that it's not milk? Well, again, you can figure it out. I guess, you can see that people drink milk. But again, how do you know that that's milk and not fat, and so forth? And really, there's not that much reference to drinking milk as much as making milk into cheese in scripture. And again, that's looking at the Bible in the big picture, which most people wouldn't be looking at the book of Samuel and comparing that where cheese is called milk and so forth, and comparing that to Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus. In any event, I want to get back to the question that we had, and then get to an issue that's close to this. But that's the answer. The Bible is pure energy. Each tradition and each denomination takes the Bible and puts it into their own. I don't know if we're going to have time to get to the subjects that we wanted to, and applies this text, and then translations of the text, often not even knowing the original languages, and developing either a theology or an ideology around the text, or having a pre-existing theology or ideology and applying it to the text. And there are examples of both. And then sometimes there are people who notice things in the text and are like, wait a second, why does this tradition and this denomination teach it this way? It makes more sense to put it this way. And so you have this conflict within the various traditions, and so that's how it's possible for a Jew, a Catholic, a Protestant, a Mormon, a Jehovah's Witness, a Seventh-day Adventist, all these different groups to be reading the same texts and coming to often radically different conclusions about what the text is telling us. Because, like this secular scholar said, the Bible doesn't have opinions. The Bible is pure energy. And that's why we insist that we need an oral tradition. Because there's nothing, you cannot have the Bible just by itself. This idea of sola scriptura is a fantasy. And Maimonides pointed that out in his day with the Karaites. He said that these groups that claim to not follow an oral tradition because they're not following our oral tradition, and they claim to be just reading the Bible and not embellishing it with anything else, are in fact just merely creating their own traditions. There's really no difference between substantively, they're fooling themselves when they claim to be sola scriptura, when they claim that they only have the Bible and nothing else, because no, they just have their own. Instead of following our actual traditions that come from Mount Sinai, they just make up their own thing, and it's just whatever they make up. And that's all well and fine for Christians who don't really have what they call our tradition legalism. Although again, it depends on which types of Christians we're talking about. Because you don't, and even those that do have legalism, generally the legalism is not coming directly from Scripture, but rather it's coming from tradition, right? And maybe they'll find the scriptural basis for it, but it's not the Scripture itself that's the source for a lot of these traditions that they have. But the traditions in the end, we're all winding up with our own things. We're all winding up. We're claiming to, those that claim to have no tradition are just still having some kind of an explanation. So I want to get to this question that our friend David had about Brahman and Brahma and Brahman all coming from the name Abraham. It's very cute, but it's kind of silly. The truth of the matter is that ideology in Hinduism is quite old. The basic the monotheistic trend of Hinduism is generally understood to be the oldest religious text, although I'm not sure if that's exactly true. But it's certainly it's certainly quite old. The Hindu belief of monotheism. So this claim that it had to come from Abraham, because they couldn't have come up with this on their own. It's somewhat I don't know if you want to say racist or bigoted or supremacist or but it's also silly. So people are going to say this. Oh, look at this, and it becomes almost canonical because look, my rabbi said this, and that's not. It's really none of our business. The same thing. You could say, in Hawaii, their priestly sect, they're the Kahuna, which sounds like our Kahuna, right? All right, you want to say that could maybe go back to the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel. That at least makes a little bit more sense than Abraham having influence in the Hindus, unless you want to say that B'nai Keturah went out east and they brought the gifts that Abraham gave the children of Keturah. Some say it's Shem Tumah and so forth. All right, I don't know. So I think it's I'm not saying it's not true, but it's somewhat silly and unnecessary. I remember one of my Rav growing up, my mother's Rav, my Baba Zeta's Rav growing up, he was very upset that he saw in the English translation of the Mayim Loaz not a medrash, it's a story that's, I think, brought from the Ramah about did Plato or Aristotle, one of the early Greek philosophers, meet the prophet Jeremiah, and the whole story about that, and he was very angry about it. He said it makes people lose faith because they're like, because it's so ridiculous and silly, and then they're going to read this in a book and they're going to think that Orthodox Judaism is silly because there's such a silly thing is in the book. Now, all right, I've heard some more rational people say, no, there is a possibility that they met. That's all right, I don't have time to go on much more, but I have a lot more to talk about. Thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe.